Right over here from biology.
How's biology going? I know you had the test the last time. Going good?
Okay, so as we're finishing up stuff here, let's just going to talk a little bit about how things are going to go over the next couple weeks. So tonight, the assignment that you started working on stuff for last time is due, that making sources speak to each other assignment. Friday, the annotated bibliography is due. And then after the break, assignments 2 and 4 on page 298 are due, your paper 1 proposal is due, and the literacy narrative, if you choose to do it, is due, right? But, you know, like I said, nobody in this class really needs to do that to pass, right? If you want the extra points, go for it. If you just want to flex your creative muscles, go for it. But nobody here has to do it, right? I will also say, too, that, you know, like, given the stress of the end of the semester and all that, like, due dates are slightly fungible for these, right? So if you can't get something done by the due date, let me know. And as long as your request is reasonable and you have behaved responsibly throughout the semester, you know, then I can give you maybe an extra day or two on certain things, right? The things that I cannot give you extra time on are the draft, because you need time to put the comments that I make into action, and the final paper, because I'm giving you as much time as humanly possible to get that done, so that I can get grades in that Monday morning.
So like what happens is, because it's happened to me countless times, like we get going like on a topic, right? And then we research and we find out like there's nothing on it.
Well, one thing you could do in a case like that is change the keywords that you're using to search, right? The fact that you're not picking up anything on it might mean that you're just not using the right search terms. So probably the best thing to do would be to make an appointment with the reference librarian and let him help you come up with better search terms. Because he will know how to get the most out of the systems, right? So just to remind everybody how to get in touch with him, right? John Wilson at gsw.edu. And yes, if you can't find anything on your, like, I think if you're looking at first generation students, right, there should be plenty of stuff on that. But again, yeah, if you're not turning stuff up, then it's probably your search terms. Any other questions about anything?
And I guess the assignment for tonight, we're doing what we did yesterday.
Yeah, you're finishing up what we did. Yeah, you're finishing up what we did on Monday, right? So we're going to finish that up in class today to give you an example of how you would do that sort of thing after we talk about some of the format stuff that was in Chapter 10. Yes?
Where it says use introduction and conclusion of article you plan to use in your paper for assignment 2 and 4, are we using 2 separate introductions and conclusions for each?
No. So this isn't what's due tonight, right? This is what's due after the break. So you're only using one of your sources for this, right? And you're doing a short analysis of the introduction and a short analysis of the conclusion.
Assignment 2 and 4 is going to combine into one?
They're listed as separate assignments, and I want you to do them and submit them as separate assignments. But yeah, you're working from the same article, right?
Okay.
And the reason why I want you to do this is because I know that introductions and conclusions are often trouble spots, and I want you to analyze how a professional academic is doing these things to give you a good model to work from.
Just in case it's not listed under the assignment, since I'm not reading the details of it, which one do you want the introduction and conclusion to be in, 2 or 4?
Okay, number 2 is the introduction assignment, and number 4 is the conclusion assignment.
Oh, okay, sweet.
Yeah, they're both on page 298 and running analytically. Now, this will also be the next to last time that we will actually meet. So instead of actually meeting on Monday when we get back, what I am going to do is set up a workshopping forum for people to talk through their paper ideas with each other.
Like on Blackboard?
On Georgia View, yeah. Yeah.
Are you still available to set up meetings? Because that proposal
Oh, yeah.
is,
Yeah, and I will be home and available throughout the break. So if you have questions or you want me to look something over the break, you can still get in touch with me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here. My wife's cousin and her fiance are coming down from Nashville, and that's it. They'll only be here, I think, from Wednesday until Friday morning. So they're not staying long. So I will be home for much of the break. Now, do I want to spend my whole break meeting with students? No. But if you need me for something, I am available. And I will still be checking email.
Except for on Thanksgiving Day.
Yeah, I probably will not be checking email at all on Thanksgiving. And I may not be checking email much on Friday either, because we might still have company.
is it okay to, like, assignments 2 and 4, if we get those in early?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, it's almost always like with drafts and papers. I don't want you to submit them early because I want you to take as much time as possible on them. Right? Use the time you have. Particularly, with drafts. If you've got something done early, you can show it to me first and then submit it. Right? And then you're getting twice as much feedback. But with the smaller assignments, yeah, you can absolutely submit those early. There's no reason why you can't do that.
Because we're hosting this year,
Mhm.
so I'm going to be cooking like all week, so I'm going to try to get it done before next week.
Yeah, whenever you get it done. Yeah, no problem.
I'll tell you how mad I was when I turned in my reflection and said I had 6%. And I was like, let's plagiarize. And of course, like the quote, even though I cited it. And then said my last name was plagiarized. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Well, and that's I always double check Turnitin. And if it's a really low percentage, I don't usually worry about it. But the other thing is, there are ways that people get around Turnitin too. Like, there are people who will, take something from a website and put in a bunch of synonyms to put it into their own words so that it doesn't pick up the plagiarism. Now, that's still usually pretty obvious because oftentimes then the sentences don't make sense.
It's just the fact that my last name was plagiarized, and I'm like, why?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, is like Turnitin isn't actually picking up plagiarism. What it's picking up is matches between your assignment and others in their database, right? So if you're working from the same material someone else is, there's going to be a certain level of match. If you have the same name as someone else in the database, there's going to be a certain level of match. It's not very sophisticated. And this is one of the fears I have regarding say like government by algorithm. I don't think we've got this quite right. But yeah, does anybody have any other questions about stuff that's coming down the pipeline? So the other thing, so Monday we won't meet. Wednesday we will meet in the computer lab, and you will have a chance to work on your drafts there with me available to look over your work or to answer questions if you have them. One of the reasons I like to do this is I generally find that if I give students a day in class to work on drafts, more people actually get it done. Again, not that I'm necessarily worried about anyone in this class actually turning something in. You guys have been thus far really good about stuff. So.
We try not to sneeze in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, and then everybody looks at you
I
funny.
did that the other day in Walmart, like I sneezed, and then literally everybody else on the aisle just like looked at me and they walked off. I'm like, really?
Yeah, I've had people in Walmart come up and yell at me for wearing a mask, so. Yeah.
It's not that big, it happens.
Takes all kinds. Okay, so does anybody have any other questions about any of this stuff? So we're only going to meet one more time 2 weeks from today.
And that'll be on Wednesday.
Yep.
In the computer lab.
Yep. The Wednesday after Thanksgiving in the computer lab. Otherwise, just look for email instructions from me for the other stuff. Does anybody still need this, or can I get rid of it? We're good? Okay. All right, so then let's talk a little bit first about the stuff in the forms and formats chapter. Now, like I told you on Monday, the really important stuff in the chapter is the stuff about paragraphing and introductions and conclusions. A lot of the rest of it was devoted to kind of like specific formats for specific disciplines. Right? We're not really worried about that in this class. This is a more kind of general writing class. But yeah, we do need to talk a little bit about paragraphing and about introductions and conclusions. So paragraphing, I think we've gone over this stuff before, but it bears reviewing. How long should a good paragraph be, roughly?
Like at least 5 sentences.
Yeah, at least 5 sentences, right? But if we're talking about how much space it takes up on the page,
Like half a page.
yeah, roughly half a page, right? A good paragraph is going to be roughly half a page.
Not specific you want it to be.
Now, this is going to be, this will vary depending on what it is you're trying to say in a paragraph. But if you try to limit the amount of space the paragraph takes up, then this will help you stick to the real principle behind paragraphing, which is one main idea per paragraph, right? Right? If you're starting on a new idea, then you need to start a new paragraph. Right, because essentially what paragraphing is a service to your reader, right? You are showing your reader that you are moving on to talk about something else now. And it makes your argument easier to follow, right? So, a good basic model to follow when constructing a paragraph is to think of it in terms of what you need to include, right? A good paragraph should include, right, one claim, one piece of evidence from which you generate that claim, and then your analysis of that piece of evidence, which should include what we call the warrant. Now, do we remember what a warrant is when we're talking about the link between claim and evidence? This is from a while ago.
What about the warrant, like the why behind it?
Yeah, the warrant is the connecting logic, right? So if you just say, you give me the piece, spit out the piece of evidence, right? And say, thus we see that claim. I don't know how you're justifying making that claim based on that piece of evidence, right? So the warrant is your justification for connecting these two ideas to each other. So to give you an example, again, just as a refresher, right? If my claim is that I am a U.S. citizen, and my evidence is that I was born in Pennsylvania, what's my warrant?
You're a U.S. citizen, but Pennsylvania is part of U.S. territory.
Yeah, and anyone who's born in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen, right? So, this is a very simplistic example, right? But the point is that you always need to explain to your reader how you got this claim from this piece of evidence, right? Because we are not mind readers, and we do not necessarily know why you are connecting these things to each other, right? So you always have to make it clear. And then explain why it matters and how it advances your argument, right? Now, the other thing that you're always going to want to do, right? You're going to want to begin a paragraph with the topic sentence that introduces your claim from the paragraph. So think of topic sentences as being almost like mini theses, right? It's like your thesis for the paragraph, right? This is the big idea that I'm working with in the paragraph. And you want to make sure that the first and last sentences link this idea to the paragraphs that come before and after. Now, this is something that we want to do more in kind of like the final stages of drafting, right? Because as we're drafting, we often tend to write paragraphs in the order that ideas occur to us, right? Not necessarily in the order that makes the best logical sense. So if you've got a paragraph in which the idea doesn't easily connect back to the one before it, then what should you do with that paragraph? Should you just delete it? Yeah, you can just move it to where it makes more sense in the overall scheme of your paper, right? Keep ideas that are closely connected together. And remember that as you're drafting, you're probably going to have to do some rearranging of paragraphs, right? The way, the order in which you spit ideas out is not often the way in which they would actually it might make sense to you, but it may not make logical sense to a reader, right? Okay, so does anybody have any questions about paragraphing, about what to include, about how long they should be, about basic structure?
So I read about I know yours is like a word count. Usually they say 5 paragraphs is like a good I don't know how to explain it. But did you aim for 5 pages or is it?
I would say are you saying like 5 pages in terms of length?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think what 2,000 to 3,000 words is going to end up being is more like kind of 7 to 9 pages.
Well, I didn't mean for that assignment, but I meant in general, because my teacher told me as long as you get your point across, you can get it down in 1 paragraph. It doesn't have to be explicitly 5 paragraphs to a good 500 pages. Okay, no, yeah, and I will say try not to think of it in terms of the number of paragraphs you need, right? I'm not worried about that. I do want you to make the length requirement, though. I want you to make at least 2,000 words, in large part because for a research paper of this type, if you don't hit 2,000 words, then you are not doing enough with your evidence. You're not saying enough with your evidence. And if you go over 3,000, then you're trying to do something that's too big for this assignment, right? So 2,000 it being the lower limit is about right size for what we're trying to do. Think of it in terms of being roughly the length of a decent book chapter, right? So basically a breakdown would be your intro paragraph and then one for each source and then your closing paragraph.
I would try not to think of it quite that specifically. Again, you may use some sources more than others, right? You may use some sources more than others, there's no real formula to that, right? Use those pieces of evidence that best suit your argument, and worry about developing that thesis throughout the paper more than anything else, right? I do expect you to use all 5 sources that you come up with, but you don't have to give equal weight to all of them. Yes?
Are we supposed to cite as we go as well, or is it with the annotated bibliography, it's just in there?
You are also supposed to cite as you go, right? So I want the same thing that I've been asking for with smaller assignments, right? The parenthetical notation. Just author, last name, page number. Any other questions about paragraphing?
I remember that in some of the feedback I got, you said it's not good to start a paragraph with a quote.
That is correct, yes. In general, and this is why I'm saying, like, begin with a topic sentence that introduces your claim, and also end with a sentence that links what you're doing in this paragraph to what you're doing in the next paragraph, right? It's always good to begin and end a paragraph with your own words. The other problem with beginning a paragraph with a quote, right, is that it means you're not doing anything to set up the quote. Right? You should always, always, always set up quotes before you insert them into the paper, right?
Kind of like Gandhi once said, and then I put the quote.
Yeah, sort of like that. Yeah, it's even better to put a short sentence explaining your general idea first, right? So something like, you know, liberal arts education helps develop well-rounded skill sets. Pigerwitz observes that, quote, blah, citation. Right. That's a good basic structure for thinking about how to set up a quote, right? And then, of course, you follow this with your analysis of the quote, right? Right. As such, we see that, right, blah. So use this as a basic model for thinking about how to do quotation, right? If you're just dropping quotes in, and I'm actually glad that somebody raised this because this is something that I forgot to deal with in planning stuff out for today. Yeah. If you're just dropping a quote in, then you're not giving your reader any context for it, right? You're not explaining your thinking here in any way. You're just expecting your reader to make the connections for themselves, right? And it always helps if you think of these kinds of things that we're doing that might seem arbitrary as service to your reader, right? It's all about making things easier for your reader. Because what's gonna, like, well, you know, think about this, right? If you are reading something and you're having a hard time making connections between the ideas and paragraphs seem to go on for days, what do you do when you're reading that?
You're like frustrated.
Lose interest.
Yeah, you get frustrated, you lose interest, you shut down, right? You don't want anyone to do that when they're reading your paper, right? You don't want me to sit there reading your paper and have my eyes glaze over and not actually go over it carefully, right? So think of that, yeah, think of, you know, trying to lead the person who's reading this along. And, you know, trying to do so in the most logical possible way. Okay, any other questions about paragraphing or quotations? Okay, then let's talk a little bit about introductions and conclusions. and then we'll go back to the stuff we were working on Monday. So what should a good introduction do?
It's kind of like the outline of the paper, that's what you're gonna talk about.
In a way, yeah. So you do want to give a short forecast to your
Like,
reader.
you could do like a background of like what you're gonna talk about, and then like you go into like, okay, we're talking about this, and that's like how your paragraphs follow.
Yeah, well, that's the way the 5-paragraph model that we often do in high school works, right? What we're going to be thinking about the introduction here a little bit differently. The problem with the kind of procedural model of the introduction is that it doesn't always really help your reader understand how these things you're talking about are connected, right? You end up with you end up with something that can be a little incoherent, right? Difficult to follow. So for example, there's one that looks kind of like this on page 275 in the incoherence section here, right? So we've got an example here of a student who is clearly writing a paper about twinship in different religious traditions. And they're basically just trying to throw everything that they've researched about twinship into this opening paragraph, right? Twinship is a symbol in many religious traditions. The significance of twinship will be discussed and explored in Native American, Japanese, Shinto, and Christian religions. Twinship can be either an opposing or common forces in the form of deities or mortals. There are several forms of twinship that show duality of order versus chaos, good versus evil, and creation versus destruction. The significance of twinship is to set moral codes for society and to explain the inexplicable. So this introduction is kind of problematic because what we've got here is a bunch of topic sentences, right? We've got a set of topic sentences for different paragraphs that clearly the student intends to develop in the paper, right? But what we don't really get here, right, is that we don't really have a strong thesis, and we don't really have anything to frame a thesis for us, right? So because all of these are claims, it's hard for, like, we're not setting up a context for a thesis statement, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Is, I guess, a good way, phrasing to put in the introduction is, throughout this paper, we will discuss so-and-so and how it relates to so-and-so?
I would say, I'm going to give you a couple of strategies here for writing a good introduction, right? The basic purpose of the introduction is to provide a context for your thesis. But you also want to lead your reader into the paper, right? So you want the introduction to be interesting, right? You don't want it to be too dry. And when we do these kinds of procedural introductions, they often end up sounding a little bit dry. And it's like, oh, well, great, this isn't going to be that interesting, right? So what I would suggest you do instead, right? One way you could start the paper and lead into your thesis is with a narrative. You can tell a little story that relates to or that exemplifies the idea that you want to deal with in the paper, right? So if, say, you are writing an argument about the difficulties experienced by first-generation students in institutions of higher education, right? You can either relate your own experiences here or talk about the experiences of some fictional student, right? You can make up a hypothetical student based on the evidence that you have collected and describe what their situation would be like, right? In brief. So a story is a really good way to get your reader's attention and grab your reader's interest, right? That can then frame the larger ideas in your thesis. Another thing you can do is start with a definition. Now, by definition, I don't mean like a dictionary definition, right? Please do not do the classic high school debate trick of, Webster's dictionary defines excellence as blah, 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 right?
So don't like the little definition of like general or higher education?
Well, you know what? If you are talking about, you will typically have to define some important aspect of your argument for your reader, right? There will be terms you will have to explain to your reader. And you might want to make sure that in this first paragraph, right, in this introduction, you are starting by providing a solid definition of the term you're talking about, right? So if we're talking, say, about liberal arts, right? Try to provide a definition of liberal arts. And this is something that is likely going to be drawn from your research that you can talk a little bit more about later, right? But when we talk about the value of a liberal arts education, we have to understand that the consensus on what liberal arts means is blah, right? Yeah, go ahead.
What about a statistic? Can you start with that?
Yeah, you can also start with a statistic. If it's a particularly interesting and arresting statistic that will lead your reader into the larger argument, if say you're writing about student athletes or something like that, right? And you note that 50% of student athletes fail a 1,000 level class in their first year of college or something like that, right? Something that really draws attention to the problem or the issue that you are trying to deal with in a significant way. Yeah, I think that is actually a good strategy. And I just made that statistic up. I have no idea what pass rates are for student athletes in 1,000 level classes, but
Would we have to add that statistic into the annotated bibliography for citing purposes?
Well, I would need to know where you got it, certainly. So you would have to provide a citation for that, yes. And I think that would be an exception to the general rule that you shouldn't be citing data in your introduction.
Does that also have to come off of Galileo?
Yes. Every piece of evidence that you're using in this paper, every source you're using in this paper needs to come from some library resource.
So it's kind of the same way with the quote, like start off with a little bit before it and then introduce your statistic or your definition or whatever.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Other things you can do. You can challenge a commonly held view. Right? So you're doing your research. You note that most of your sources are arguing that the numbers suggest that student athletes struggle in gen ed classes. But you think that maybe your sources are interpreting the numbers that they're using incorrectly, right? And so you offer a different interpretation of the same data than your sources are giving, right? Now, this requires a certain level of confidence.
How do you do that without saying
You don't have to, like, there's no hard and fast rule that you don't use I.
Yeah, but you said you want us to try to stay objective, so like, you can't, like,
Mhm.
it's harder to be like, this is what the paper says, but like, I say differently, because like, you can't really like say I.
Yeah, well, you can still find ways around that, right? So instead of saying I think, you can say things like the evidence, looked at another way, the evidence suggests, blah, 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 right? So you can still find ways to frame it that don't use the word I, right? And yeah, if you have trouble with that, then let me know and I'll help you and I can suggest things for you. But yeah, and again, like the whole thing about not using I is about maintaining some level of critical distance and not just sort of offering opinion. You want reasoned arguments that are drawn from evidence. Yeah, go ahead.
In the paper, I know that I used however we can see, like I made it a generalized kind of thing.
Yeah.
Take away from just my personal, because I know that other people.
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, like I would say, like generally, at least in kind of beginning writing courses, you should try to avoid the first person pronoun altogether. Again, like not a hard and fast rule. Think of it situationally, right? Like if you feel like you are expressing an opinion or a feeling that is not backed up by evidence, avoid using I, right? Because then you will be able to step back and examine it more critically, right? If you feel like, this is not something, this is not just sort of your personal feeling, right? If you feel you are being objective, then I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's not something that I'm going to take off, like going to take off points for, right? It's more about something that will just help you stay objective. And I think, we tend to get a little bit too hung up sometimes on what we think of as rules. And, the only rule, really, is that you construct a clear, consistent, and convincing argument, right? And that's really going to have to do more with how you treat your evidence and the claims you draw from your evidence than whether or not you are using or not using first-person pronouns. Okay. Anything else we need to say about introduction? All right. So the introduction should always culminate in your thesis statement, right? The best place to put your thesis is right at the end of your introduction. It's not the only place you can put one, but especially in the purposes of for the purpose of a 1,000 level class like this, it's the best place to put it. So keep that in mind the whole time you're writing the introduction, right? Now, do you have to write the introduction first? Is there any rule that you need to write an introduction before you start working on the rest of the paper?
I don't even know what my thesis is yet, so.
Yeah. So it often helps if you start writing the rest of if you just start writing the rest of the paper first, right? And then go back and write the introduction when you have a clearer idea of what it is you are trying to say, right?
So basically, you'll make your thesis and you'll find evidence to support it, and then go back afterwards and write your intro and ending.
Mostly, except don't start with a thesis already in mind, right? Start with an idea that you want to research, do the research, and let the research condition what your thesis is going to be, right? Because you should, if you already have a clear thesis in your head, like a clear thing you want to argue, what are you going to do with your evidence?
You're going to find things that match it?
Yeah, you're only going to find things that support the idea you already have, right? So this is one of the reasons why I wanted you guys to do the annotated bibliography first, before you write the proposal and before you write the draft, so that you're doing the research before you're coming up with a thesis. Because I want your thesis to be grounded in the evidence that you find. Yes?
I'm going to throw out some examples.
Okay.
Is a good thesis statement such as how authoritative parenting is the best parenting style for higher education, or something along that lines, or how parenting styles are destroying education in America, or something like that.
Okay, so if what you want to do is think about, like, so I think what I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're trying to discuss here is the extent to which parenting styles influence student success in higher ed.
Something along that lines. And
Okay, yeah. So I think like you're probably what you would want to start with, right? You want your initial thesis to be relatively broad. So in the case of, say, what you are suggesting, you would start by arguing that parenting styles either do or do not influence student success in college, right? Or really even more the extent to which they do, right? Then what you're going to be doing throughout the paper is narrowing that idea down by testing it against pieces of evidence, right? So you might want to think of the shape of the paper as being kind of like a funnel, right? You start with your working thesis in the introduction, and by the time you get to the conclusion, you have a much more narrow, specific, and qualified idea of that thesis, right? So you may come to the conclusion, for example, that certain specific parenting styles help or hinder success in higher education, and like that's the sort of thing that you would then state in your conclusion, right?
so, okay, say, start off introduction in 2019, insert statistic, insert rest of introduction, and then
Mhm.
put in a broad idea of thesis statements such as looking at the parenting styles.
Yeah,
You
now-
can see that they factor into.
Yeah, it still has to be argumentative, right? Yeah, it still has to be argumentative, right? It still has to take a position. But you can take a much less specific position in the conclusion than you will adopt, or in the introduction you will adopt in the conclusion, right?
And then as you go down, be like, this parenting style is the best parenting style, essentially, at the end of the paper.
I would try to avoid, in part, like, one thing you'll notice about academics is that we don't like absolutes. We always like to kind of carefully qualify things. So I would try to avoid superlatives, right? I would try to avoid, words like best or worst. Instead, what you want to do is just, demonstrate somehow, like set some sort of criteria for what success would be, and show which parenting style comes closest to that criteria,
Like,
right?
this one has been shown to have the highest success ratings out of the group.
Yeah, you're getting a little closer to the mark there, yeah. Yeah. But we're kind of wandering a little bit off topic here. Does anybody have other questions about introductions specifically?
I think we've probably covered this at one point, but I'm absorbing a lot of information. So how long is the introduction typically? A page?
I would follow the same general rule, roughly half a page. Yeah, you don't want it to be too long. You don't want to include too much in the introduction, because then the reader's going to shut down, right?
Is that before or after double spacing? Before?
After.
Okay.
After double spacing, yeah. No, half a page single spaced ends up being a full page double spaced, right? So yeah, I would say yeah. Try to keep everything. Yeah, just try to keep to the rough half a page rule, right? Any other questions about introductions? Okay, then let's talk a little bit about conclusions, right? Now, what is the most common mistake, do you think, that students make when writing conclusions?
I know mine is
Okay, that can be an issue, right? If your conclusion is too long, it probably means that you haven't really thought through what all of this data means, right?
I mean, you did that for me one time, where I was like, you know, it's kind of like up to you to decide, like it wasn't very clear, it was kind of like open-ended.
Yeah. You weren't kind of coming down firmly on any particular side of the question, right? So one problem that is often an issue with the conclusion is kind of wishy-washiness, right? That you're not really, like, this can be a problem with introductions and thesis statements too, right? Is you're not really taking a stand. But yeah, you want to make sure that you take a firm stand on your particular research question. And you're providing a real answer to it, not just a bunch of possible answers and letting the reader try to decide on their own, right? What other mistake do you think students commonly make in writing conclusions?
Too short?
Yeah, sometimes they're too brief, right? You just say, thus we see that blah, blah, blah was right all along, and then you're done, right? So this doesn't give the reader anything to think about as they're exiting the paper, right? Two things I'm going to say that will serve you well in future classes. What 2 words should you never start a conclusion with?
In conclusion.
Yes. Never start your conclusion with in conclusion. There are 2 reasons for this, right? One is that it's redundant, right? It's the last paragraph of your paper. Your reader can see that it's the conclusion, doesn't need to be told, give them some credit, right? The other problem is that when we say in conclusion, we make it sound like the question that we're examining is completely closed. And we don't want to do that, right? Related to this is the conclusion that simply restates the introduction verbatim, right? So you want to revisit, but not repeat the introduction. So let's talk about how we do that, right? So I've already kind of shown you that, model of, the basic body of the paper, right? You start with the broad working thesis and you come with a much more narrow specific thesis about the conclusion. So you are going to present in the conclusion the final version of your thesis after having tested it against all the evidence. Yes?
So could you start with from where we started with so-and-so about so-and-so?
Mm-hmm.
We can come to find throughout all of this blah, 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 that this is this.
Yeah, reference what you said in the introduction, right? And apply what you've done in the paper, right? After examining the evidence, this is the conclusion that I've come to, right? Now, other things that you want to think about in the conclusion, you don't want to introduce new information, right? Don't introduce new information, don't introduce new evidence. But think about the implications of what you've done here, right? Right, given what my final thesis looks like, what else? Is suggested, right? If authoritarian parenting really leads to greater success in college students, what else must be true, right? Or, what might be true, what must be true about parenting in general, or how must this relate to the structure of higher education, that sort of thing, right? And is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? Right. What should we do about this? The other thing you might want to do is acknowledge the limitations of your study. And suggest avenues for future research. Right, so, say you only had kind of like the time and space to focus on one particular parenting style, right? In your paper. So you say that. So what I might want to do then is see if the results that I got for authoritarian parenting are an outlier in any way, right? Are they significantly different from the results I would get from looking at children whose parents had a more relaxed style, right? Something like that.
People in Europe, because we're like more authoritarian over here, like we're more authoritative, and they say like that's the best parenting style. So it depends on like what you
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to be honest. It's not something that I know very much about. I don't have kids.
Well, I'm just saying like you could say like okay, well it's like one way over here, but it's one way over there, and you can like maybe compare the two and say like well which one is better.
Okay, yeah, you've got right. Yeah, you could weigh different. Like probably the best way to look at this would be to like something like this would be to weigh similar parenting styles that have some kind of important difference, right? Then think about what's the key factor that separates these two, right? That leads to greater or less student success. Any other questions about any of this stuff? Okay, so we don't have a whole lot of time left here. But I do want to quickly demonstrate to you how to put sources into conversation with each other to give you an easier time with tonight's assignment. So probably the best place to start would be to rehearse some of what we said last time about the Gorton and Egan articles. So, do we remember what the main question both of these writers were focused on was? And what the big claims they were making were?
That's a handout that you gave.
Yeah, this is the handout, yep.
It's like, I'm not prepared. Well, it's covering general education curriculum at the beginning.
Yeah, so both of them are concerned with gen ed curricula.
And then understanding the relationship between disciplines.
Yeah. So that's Elizabeth Gorton's big claim, right? This first sentence here, right? The general education curriculum is for most students their entree into understanding the disciplinary structure of the institution and understanding the relationship between disciplines. So general education is a way to get students to see relationships between disciplines. So let's think about what assumption about students and about general education is baked into this claim. Does she think that students need to have this relationship explained to them? Or does she seem to think that this understanding is baked into the curriculum and that students will get it if they take gen ed classes?
I'm sorry, were we talking about Burton?
Gordon, yep.
I think from my scanning,
Uh-huh.
essentially from them pursuing their wants, they end up obtaining what they need to do.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so we can say that she seems to be assuming that just taking the gen ed classes will show them how things link up, right? Now, what about Egan's argument, Egan's approach here? When Egan is talking about these distribution versus core models, do you remember what the difference was here, what this meant? What a distribution model versus a core model is?
I just saw it.
Okay, so quick reminder.
There it is,
One of
okay.
them was like, you have to take them because you have to, the other one's like, you choose which ones you want to do.
Yeah, so like what we have in the university system of Georgia is a core system, right? Everybody takes more or less the same classes, right? You might have a couple of options here and there, right? You can take Brit Lit 2 instead of World Lit 1. You can take World Civ 1 or World Civ 2, things like that, right? But everybody's got to take that 2000 level lit. Everybody has to take Comp 1 and Comp 2. Everybody has to take American Government, World Civ, US History, right? Everybody has to take a foreign language. So in a core model, the requirements are laid out for you. In a distribution model, the students choose classes that fill sort of broad categories. Right, I think, last time I used the example of the formal logic class that I took instead of taking math, right? Because they both filled a reasoning requirement and I was math phobic. But formal logic was at 8 in the morning. I didn't get along with the professor, and it was actually harder than math, so I ended up getting a D, right? So this didn't actually work out too well for me. But the point I'm trying to make here, and I think the point that Egan is making, right, is that if they're not guided by a good advisor, students in a distribution system will make poor choices, right? They will make choices that do not link up with any larger educational goals because they'll just be doing shit like trying to avoid certain hard classes or trying to avoid classes that meet too early in the morning and things like that, right? So how might Egan, just looking at this distribution versus core model, respond to Gordon about this? Does Gordon seem to be making a distinction between different models of gen ed?
Yes.
Does Gordon in the first article seem to be making, is she talking about distribution versus core models or
No.
making any kind of distinction at all between these?
Not that
So Egan is making a distinction that Gordon doesn't, right? So Egan might say to Gordon that she's assuming that all models of general education work the same way, right? That she's not breaking down different types of gen ed and thinking about what students need within them, right? I'm just offering a model here of what we want to do for the assignment tonight, right? You might also respond to Gordon that her notion that by taking gen ed classes, students see the relationship between disciplines is too simplistic, right? Because he seems to be arguing that students need good advising to make better choices and see the relationships between their gen ed classes and the other things they're doing, right? So, Gordon seems to be assuming coherence in a gen ed curriculum. Egan isn't saying the coherence isn't there. But he would say that we have to consider how different models work, and that students might need help seeing these connections. So see how we've taken one point here in both essays where the writers seem to be talking about the same thing, but in slightly different ways, right? And we're imagining how one of them might respond to the assertions that the other makes. Does this make sense to you guys? Does everybody understand? No, you're confused, Hannah? Where did I lose you?
I'm still kind of like confused on what we have to do. Like, I got like when we're doing like the binaries and stuff, and I don't know like how to like put them together. And, like, well, they said this, but then they said that, and like try to like figure out what's like the problem.
Okay, so what we're doing is finding places where they seem to be talking about the same thing, right? So
Is this before how we would set up the, good Lord, help me with it, I can't even remember it. Like, we went through the stages, the similarities, and like when we were doing the videos and stuff. Yeah, so you're using the same you're using the same method to pick the articles apart first, right? And you're going to find a place where they're talking about something very similar, right? So here what we're talking about in both articles is the relationship between the student and the gen ed curriculum, right? And this idea that the general education curriculum should show students how the classes they're taking are connected, right? And what I'm saying, like the assumption in Gordon's claim here, right? When she says the general education is a way to get students to see relationships between disciplines.
So like that's what they have, that's like different from each other, and then the coherence, they have that's similar to each other.
Yeah, well, the fact that they're both talking about students needing to take gen ed, right? But what Egan is doing is taking a more complicated position than Wharton is taking, right? What Wharton is saying is that the gen ed curriculum, as it is, gets students to see how the disciplines they're taking are related, or how the classes they're taking are related, right? All you got to do is take biology and history and American government and all that, right? And you'll see the connections. What Egan would say to that, because Egan is interested in this difference between distribution and core models of general education, right? So what he is saying is actually there are different ways universities do general education. And at least if we're talking about this particular model, right? Which Wharton isn't making any distinction between different models, right? She's just talking about general education broadly. Do we all understand that? That Egan is making a distinction here that Wharton doesn't, right? So he's getting more specific than she is about general education. So what he's saying is that her idea of general education is too simple. And it doesn't acknowledge that students, particularly if they're picking their own classes, rather than going through a preset curriculum, are going to need help from an advisor to understand how some of these things fit together. Yes?
So essentially it's stating that it doesn't have all of the facts, and without all of the facts, it doesn't have a stance necessarily.
Yeah, what he says, like, if we get more specific about what we mean by general education, right, then the idea that students are just going to see how things come together doesn't hold up. That in fact, what they need is good advising.
I'd personally be lost without my advising.
Well, one hopes everyone is getting good advising, you know. But so, do we see now what we like? What we because I just don't know how else to explain this.
I think I have an idea of it. Now, if this was what we were writing our paper on, we would have to take and compare those points.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
lay
So
out in the paper and how it's missing this, but it's symbolized.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah,
Similar here.
yeah, exactly. So first you're looking for those points of similarity, right? Okay, where are they talking about things that are the same or things that are similar? And then once you've found those points of similarity, you're looking for those places where they diverge, right? They seem to agree with each other up to this point, but not past it, right? And then you're thinking about how they might respond to these differences or disagreements, right?
Like, see, that's where you lose me. Like,
Okay.
How they respond.
So, all right. So, let me think about this for a second.
I was personally going to write, one might think that as this stance is here, while this one's here, now we have going forward so-and-so, so-and-so.
Okay, so let me put it this way. All of the content you need to answer the questions is there, right? But what you have to do is use what the other writer has said to imagine a response. So Egan doesn't actually say this in his article, right? But we can infer this from what he does say and by comparing it to what Wharton has said, right? So what we have to do is think about how each of the, like, given the information we have from each of these articles, right, how each writer would respond to a question from the other. Yeah.
I'm going to give an example. Okay, so where Egan felt that the connections necessary for their students' academic careers were lost on Gervin. And the students were left to their own devices.
Yeah,
Something
well,
like that.
well, what you're doing is detecting a gap in what Wharton has said, right? And then you're using what Egan says to go after that gap, right? if Egan was reading Wharton's essay, given what he says in his essay, how would he respond to the claims that she makes? That's the basic question that you're trying to deal with here.
So something similar to empty, without connection,
Yeah,
unstructured.
well, I'm even kind of trying to think less specifically, like beyond this specific essay, right? So like, I just lost my train of thought. Hold on. It's okay. Okay, so what we notice here, right, when we're comparing the two articles, is that Egan makes a distinction about general education that Wharton doesn't, right? She talks about general education as though it's all one thing. He is talking about two different models of general education, right?
And like she's only talking about like general education as a whole.
Yeah, whereas he's talking about it as a more complicated thing, right? So that's where we can see where he might say that what she's saying is too simple, right?
Oh, like he's more specific and she's too broad, basically. Like he's going like into specifics and she's just doing like a broad spectrum of general education.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like so if we're even thinking about just like a question he might ask her directly, right? You know, he might just say, so well, okay, well, what do you mean by general education, right? How does general education work at your institution? Do you have this model or do you have this model? She doesn't say, right? Yes.
I keep throwing out examples there because I'm trying to grasp. So if we took it to the shoe on the other foot, so to say, and it would be her responding to something in his.
Yeah.
Perhaps being too involved, and that would create the student to never progress forward.
Mhm.
Something like that, and putting that into
Well-
like that gap.
Well, we might actually think about something and say, like, what else, where else, we can look at another place where they differ, right? Who is she mostly concerned about talking to?
The student.
Is Gordon concerned about talking to the students to find out what they want and what they need?
Unless she's talking to the parents.
Yeah, she talks about the parents, right? Egan is talking about directly reaching the students through advising, right? So, whereas Egan says we need to reach the students through advising, right? Gorton might say we need to convince the parents of the value of this first, right? And parents are not going to understand this distinction between distribution and core models. So in order to reach them, then we need to speak about this more generally.
I think you're gonna get a D from me.
Like,
I'm gonna be honest.
I honestly, like, I think you guys are making this harder than it is.
Perhaps it would be easier when we sit down with actual material and take it apart.
Yeah, and you know, this might also have been easier if there was less time between picking the thing apart and trying to go over it now, right? Like, you guys can do this, right? I have seen you already do things like this. You have done similar things with the essays in Reading the World that we have been looking at all semester, right? You can do this. And like the one thing that I will say, like one, right, worst case scenario, right, you mess it up, you still get some points and you get feedback, right? You know, nobody is in a position where if you screw up this assignment, you're going to fail the class. So don't stress yourself out too much about it.
I think we both want that GPA up.
Right, but you know, what I'm saying is, like, this is a single 5-point assignment. You've both been doing like A and B level work all semester. If you don't do well on this, right, it's not, you know, it's not the end of the world. But it's also like if you don't try, then you'll never figure out how to do it, right? So at a certain point, you just have to trust yourself and give it a shot.
I think the hardest part too is putting it
Yeah, right, because right, you have to take something, some things that people have said and imagine how they might respond to someone else's argument, right? It feels like putting words in someone's mouth.
I have a very creative imagination when it comes to writing, I just don't know if it's gonna be what you're looking for.
Well, and like, again, like, all I can say at this is like, just, we're out of time, so like, just try it, right? Just try. If you have questions while you're working, if you want to run something by me tonight before you turn something in, I will be checking email intermittently, right? If you need extra time to finish the assignment, let me know. But yeah, like, on the whole, right? Don't freak out about it. It's going to be okay.
I think my brain is just mush from everything else, but it's just like, I don't know. That's what other stuff going on right now. Kind of like, stressing me out.
Yeah, but it's seriously, like, don't let this stress you out too much, right? It's one assignment. It's 5 points out of 100. As long as you do something, you'll get some points, right? And yeah, it's not the end of the world if it's not perfect. But you never learn how to do it if you don't practice.